Good evening and welcome to the Kansas Legislature. My name is Mike Walker. I'm with the Docking Institute of Public Affairs at Fort Hays State University. Fort Hays State University nestled along the banks of the Big Creek. With me today I have three representatives. I always try to start with a joke and it never works. I have three representatives from the Kansas Legislature. On my immediate right is Representative Stephen Johnson. He represents District 108 from Assaria. I said that correctly, didn't I?
You did.
All right, very good.
Right.
On my left is Representative Brad Ralph from District 119, representing Dodge City, or from Dodge City. And on my far right is Representative Troy Waymaster, representing District 109, and from right here in Bunker Hill. I think we'll start off with just going out in the same order. If you wouldn't mind describing your district and letting the people know in the audience what your district is like.
Sure, be glad to get to do that. So as you'd mentioned, I'm from Assaria. The one county I have all of is Ellsworth County, and then the district goes south into the northern part of Rice County, on into Saline County, the southern part of that, and just the city of Lindsborg and McPherson County. So those are the boundaries, and I would share my western boundary with Representative Waymaster.
Right, very good. All right.
Mike, I'm Brad Ralph. I represent the 119th district. That district is encompassed entirely within the city limits of Dodge City, so I feel like maybe I'm not carrying my load sometimes with the folks that have several counties or several cities. I have a school district, a county, a city, a hospital, but they're all confined within the city limits of Dodge City.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and as you mentioned in the opening, I'm Troy Waymaster from the 109th Kansas House District, and I have in total 7 counties in my district.
Wow.
The entire counties of Russell, Osborne, and Smith, the western half of Jewell County, the western half of Lincoln County, a different kind of boundary in Barton County where I have the largest landmass but I have the least population. I share that with 2 other representatives in Barton County, and on the eastern half of Rush County.
Very good, thank you. I want to remind folks that this is a call-in show. This is a great opportunity for you to call in and speak to your representatives. The number is on your screen, but I'll read it off. 1-800-337-4788. You got me there. Yes, please call in. We'll be glad to answer your questions the best we can. You know, one thing you mentioned, actually, as you were all speaking about your districts, how we often think of Western Kansas as very much the same, but actually it's very different. You represent the city of Dodge City, and the other districts are a mix of maybe not urban places, but urban small cities and also rural areas, which I think is something to bring up, because we often think of maybe Kansas as the eastern side and the western side, but even out here in the west we have quite a variety of issues we have to deal with. I have a list of issues I would like to bring up and discuss, but if maybe we'll go around the same order we did before, and if you have something that you want to bring up as we get this ball rolling here that you've been working on in the legislature the past week or so. Do you mind starting?
Be glad to. And we were all working together in the last week on a number of things. So the budget, which Representative Waymaster leads, had the most meetings, and they did a lot of work getting into the details of the budget. Education funding was a large debate for us, one we needed to have and work through to figure out where we were so that the courts can pick that up and go on from there. I do work with the tax issues. We were working in the conference committee setting, which is, there are a couple of bills from the House that have passed, one that we need to get through for Russell County and Thomas County and a couple of other counties to have a sales tax election. Those are on deck to be passed. And the Senate also has passed a number of bills, so we were looking at what they had done, and with that we were going to see if there are some of their ideas that we could incorporate into the House bills. The conference committee process is an important part of the process, but it is one where some curveballs can be thrown in terms of what comes together, how different bills are packaged, which our colleague from Dodge City works on a lot with judiciary. There are just so many bills. Right. And that then was the process that we were kind of embroiled in during the last week, were what ideas do we want to save and be able to continue to move forward this session.
Okay. Well, thought we had a caller, but we don't. So Brad, would you mind, if you don't mind, we'll move to Brad.
That sounds fine.
No, absolutely. As as Representative Johnson mentioned, I serve in the Judiciary Committee. I think probably just in terms of sheer numbers of pieces of legislation, we probably top out in that committee just for what is passed out of there. And that does, toward the end of the session, take some significant amount of work for combining several pieces of legislation, sometimes to get them through the House and cross over to the Senate in a timely manner. And we did work on quite a few numbers of pieces of legislation. We passed out some legislation toward the end of the session that I think will provide some assistance to domestic abuse victims in landlord-tenant situations to try and ease some of the concern there. Passed some legislation in regard to responsibilities for buried utility lines in some locations, and if we have an opportunity, we can talk about that a little bit later. One piece of legislation that came out that seems to be kind of a nice topic around several communities was we've lessened the number of safety type drills for schools this year and dropped those numbers down, which seems to have had a positive impact on several of our districts. So quite a few things coming down through those last several weeks.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, we'll touch on some of those issues later on, hopefully. Troy?
Well, in the last week that we were in session before we adjourned last Friday and came home to our respective districts, as both Stephen and Brad had already discussed, is that we looked at numerous conference committee reports that came from the conference committees between the House and the Senate members serving on those conference committees, and then sending those back to the respective chambers for an up and down vote, and then hopefully those pass and then go on to the governor. As Stephen mentioned, I spent quite a bit of my time in conference committee with the Senate in regards to the budget. We both passed out a budget, both out of the House and of the Senate, and then we went to conference committee to work out those differences between the two budgets from those two chambers, and we pretty much agreed on a lot of items. We made a lot of progress. However, we did come to a decision that we probably, and that was actually a request by me, that we need to halt discussion on the budget because we were making no movement on two items. And one of those items was some language that was added in the Senate budget bill in regards to Medicaid expansion. They wanted to have tighter language in the budget, even though we already have existing law that says any type of Medicaid expansion has to be a legislative action. This was language which actually changed 4 times while we were in conference committee, which just tightened that where it had to be by legislative action. I thought it was redundant, not needed. We already have existing law that says it has to be done by legislative action, so I don't think it's warranted to be in the budget bill. The other is the Senate and the House have a different position in regards to the Pooled Money Investment Board loan that we took out in 2017. This was a loan that we use as a way of balancing the books in regards to the rescission bill. And the Senate wants to pay it all off in 2019, which the governor had indicated that she wanted to do that in her budget presentation as well. The House is taking more of a, I would say, a conservative approach and saying, yes, we would like to expedite the payment structure of that loan, but maybe not necessarily pay it off all in 2019. I don't think, it's a 0% loan. There's really no reason to pay it all off or expedite the payments, which the House did agree to, but there's no financial advisor that would tell you you need to pay off a 0% loan first when you have other debts that are accumulating interest, where we could probably be looking at that. And we're not even looking at some of the bonds that the state of Kansas currently has. Instead, the action was to pay this all off in first in 2019. Those are the 2 items that stalled us in conference committee. I did meet with Governor Kelly on Friday before we adjourned. She is accommodating to the House position because she realizes that that money that could be used, as opposed to paying it all off in 2019, can be used for the Kansas Department of Transportation. Right. It can be used for other programs for one-time money. So she and I did have a conversation about that. So right now the House is still holding the position of the Pooled Money Investment Board loan. We'll see what happens when we get back on May 1st and we go back into conference with the Senate.
So it sounds like the House as a whole is pretty much in agreement that why pay this off now, why not stretch it out a bit and pay some other...
You know, I really haven't had anybody in the House come up to me and say we need to pay this off this year.
Okay.
That's been a Senate position. Okay. It's been a position of the governor. But when we had that in our mega budget bill that we passed 2 weeks ago, as a provision of expediting the payments. We had a 5-payment structure. The Appropriations Committee decided to cut that back to 3, so we pay it off sooner. But at no time did I ever have anybody say, I want to pay this off in 2019.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And it's great to reduce debt, but the discussion was, as Troy mentioned, there are higher rates. So not only are we looking at this year, but next year there's a large increase in the CAPERS payment again. Thankfully, it would be our last large one if we meet that. But could we meet that with greater certainty if there's some balance that is carried over? And all of those are part of the discussion to figure out how much of each of those and pools we want to pay off. Now, we absolutely want to take a step. We absolutely want to stay ahead of schedule, as Troy mentioned, so paying off more than was originally scheduled. But just taking a broader look at the other debts before we say, okay, let's eliminate the 0% one.
Very good.
And we're still coming out of a deep hole. So to go ahead and just start paying off that loan, or and we also had to address K through 12 education. I'm sure we're going to have a discussion on that later. There are some other things that we still need to address. The Department of Children and Families is one that we spent a lot of time in appropriations. Mental health was another one we spent a lot of time on. So there's a lot of the programs that until we had a flush account like we do now, they suffered. And we need to go back and readdress those and bring them up to the levels where we see as adequate.
Mike, it might be of value to folks at home to know that when we talk about the conference committees, Chairman Waymaster and the Vice Chair of Appropriations and our ranking member carry the House positions into those conference committees. So he's carrying quite a load during these sessions of the in and out on that. But when you talk about the House's position, they carry that position into those conference committees with the Senate, and they're kind of out on an island out there as they work through this past week. They've got a lot going on.
That's a good analogy, out on an island. It is. You feel like you're out on an island during some of those conversations.
Yes, I know. Imagine so. Let me go ahead and remind viewers, that this is a call-in show. I guess I was hoping callers. The number is 1-800-337-4788. 1-800-337-4788. So please call in with your questions. Brad, if you want to, real quick, can you describe, you mentioned the bill to reduce the number of safety drills. I want to make sure people understand that there's still going to be safety drills. So can you go through a little bit of that? It's not the probably most hard-hitting issue, but I think it's probably important.
Yeah, and I think it's probably one of those issues, Mike, that actually has some actual impact that people may see on a broader spectrum. Over the course of the years and through legislation, obviously, we pass different bills and different pieces of legislation from year to year that affect whether we might have crisis drills or fire drills or tornado drills. And over the course of time, if we dictate that there should be 3 of these types of drills, and then another couple of years later we need 4 more drills on this, and sometimes potentially we lose track of what we're piling on in there, and all of a sudden it became apparent that the legislature had dictated that there were 16 different types of drills that were mandated to be carried out every school year by schools. And so when you talk about having 16 drills a year, I think somebody told me that that's like maybe every 10 days of school they were having some kind of drill. And so you can imagine what a disruption that can be. Obviously, you don't want to talk about being prepared for catastrophes, weather issues and such as an inconvenience, but there also needs to be some balance. And so when we looked at those complete numbers, there was a reduction in the total number that were to be required from 16 down to 9. And so without sacrificing safety and being prepared, if you will, we thought the 9 number was a better idea in terms of really giving some consideration to how much effort needs to be placed on that for the safety of the students and staff and the community. So it seems like over this past week in conversations with folks, that's been well received, that reduction in number.
Right. Well, 9 is still 1 a month basically, so it's still a lot of safety training going on. And of course, times have changed. Back in the day, it was a fire drill and a tornado drill. Now it's all the other kind of safety drills. So very good.
Right. And if a group felt they needed more drills, they could certainly have them, but felt that was a lot better baseline to start with.
And I believe when we had that discussion, there was an amendment to bring in like a certain number scheduled, and the state fire marshal said, well, that kind of lessens the impact of having them, because when a catastrophe happens, it's not going to be a scheduled catastrophe. So you've got to have that
Surprise
the
element or something.
time at the moment.
Yeah, time of the moment.
Where there might be basically have a drill for a catastrophe.
But good point. Schools can have more if they want to, so that's great. All right. Okay.
And then I think, aren't you the vice chair for the Judiciary Committee?
Vice Chair of Judiciary. Yes.
So you get to be in all of those conference committees as well.
Yeah, with the conference committees was a new experience for me this year in terms of being involved in those. Now I will say our conference committees on the judiciary seem to be a little smoother than some of the others I have seen out there. But yeah, it's a good opportunity to work with our colleagues from the Senate in regard to those. Many times there are just pieces of legislation that can't or don't have time to get passed through one chamber or the other. And so at the conference committee time, it's a good opportunity to potentially to move some pieces of legislation that haven't been seen all the way around, move those into a conference committee to be able to get those out. For example, this year we had some updates to the LLC Uniform Code. Certainly not an exciting topic, but it's something that for business folks, those updates keeps us in line, cutting edge, if you will, with regard to the rest of the nation. And those needed to get passed, and we started running out of some time and getting some things across. We were able to get those packaged in during conference committee and get those out. That's a significant item for the business community in the state.
Very good, very good. I think we might have a caller on the line in a second. I want to ask if you had some more legislative issues you want to bring up. But since we do have a caller, Dave from Dodge City, you're on the line. Go ahead, Dave.
Yes, I have a question for the representatives.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay, the Farm Bureau Health Insurance Bill
Okay.
seems like it's getting a lot of favored votes in the House. And I'm curious as to why they're allowing the Farm Bureau to have the health insurance, the selected group of people, and letting them slide by with the other health insurance companies that have to meet other regulations. Would the representatives like to explain their vote on that, please?
Very good. Thank you for your call. Somebody want to start off with a description of what the situation is about?
What the bill that we passed is actually not health insurance. It's the authorization for Farm Bureau to create a health insurance plan and then offer that to their members.
Right.
In regards to Dave's question regarding why did we single out Farm Bureau as opposed to other organizations, we've singled out other organizations in the past. And this is why Farm Bureau has now come forward to us and has asked for the authorization to be able to offer to their members a health insurance plan that they would find more affordable for their members. So it has been done in the past. Like the trucking association was authorized to do that. There are a number of other groups that the legislature has authorized for them to do this, and so this is why Farm Bureau asked us for that authorization so they can offer this to their members.
Very good. Something to add to that?
And in that case, when you have any group that isn't officially a part of a group, insurance is very expensive. So the Farm Bureau Association said, hey, how could we come together and form a group that could provide an option to members? It's an option, certainly not required.
Right.
And one of the challenges also is who would be part of it. So what do you do with pre-existing conditions, which has been a concern for how that would come together. But the key for that is it allows, at least if that is a better alternative for that group, they can move forward with that if it is in their best interest. And the other thing that is useful, if we try and take a broader perspective, as Representative Waymaster said, there are other groups. But if we could get even one level down to where we can just talk well about the reform issues that we want, whether it's health care, whether it's education, whether it's entitlement, but how would we better offer health care? How do we better provide and pay for the services that we need, where we need them, when we need them? I hope that a lot of groups will continue to try and think of another way to approach that situation in a better way to eventually serve all of us more efficiently with health care and insurance.
Very good. I think we have a caller on the line. We can discuss this more later, but Bob from Hayes, you're on the line. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering, as a state employee, we have to donate to or give money to Capers. I mean, why do we have to do that? Number one. Number two, and we have no say on where it's invested or anything. And then, then it's you guys underfund it and don't know if it's going to be there for us. But I just want to know, why do we have to do Capers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You want to describe Capers?
Well, you always want to put a time limit on that. So Capers, our Kansas Public Employee Retirement System, it is a program that does provide a pension for state employees. On why they have to, I have to go deeper on that. I think that was an agreement that may even get involved with the unions of what has to happen for that to work, and he's right, they're not able to opt out of that. We have Capers as well to invest in. I have looked at the portfolio very carefully, and Capers does a great job of investing. And as I look at what I could do other than that, it's hard to beat on a risk-adjusted basis. The expense ratio is under 30 basis points for both administrative and investment management. It includes private equity and things that I don't have available in my portfolio. So that part, I actually think, is done pretty well, and I've been very impressed with how Capers works, and that is one of the businesses that I've worked in outside of the legislature, and I'm familiar with that. To the underfunding piece, that is a great point. Capers has been underfunded actually since it was the state retirement system for teachers prior to 1970 in the 60s, and some of that debt is probably still carried today if we looked at exactly how it works. We're not certain when we made the last fully required payment, but we know it was sometime before 1992, so it has been chronic.
Wow.
The most recent one was this year. This is the first time that we have, and since 2011 we have increased the rate, and a number of people have worked hard, so it didn't just happen in 2011, have increased that rate to catch it, and finally the state has made that, which is really big in that it's not only for the current people but making up for all the missed payments. Right. So at the current time there's a bit of good news on Capers funding. We went from second worst to the second quartile on our funded ratio since 2011. So progress has been made, but more still has to be made. Whether or not it is of value to the employees is something that probably we would have to work with through the unions. When we looked at refiguring the benefit, the one that weighed in as we looked at a defined contribution plan to something else was largely through the employee union on the type of design that they wanted. So I think we could work with that group if there was a different setup that we thought was preferable.
I think the last question that Bob had asked is, will it be there when he wants to take the benefit? And yes, it will be. There may have been cases in the past where we may have not made a payment one particular year, but the trust fund itself is never touched. It cannot be touched. In fact, somebody had said, if you want to talk about a true lockbox in Topeka, it's the trust fund for Capers. Going back with what Stephen had answered in regards to the reason why you can't opt out, I don't know the historical data on that. I would probably presume that they wanted to have the larger pool of employees, so you have the contributions coming in, and then that money can be invested. That'd be my guess as to why you cannot opt out of Capers. But as far as it being there in the future when you'll need the benefit, it'll be there.
Okay. Let me, we can get back to Capers in a bit, but I think we have a couple people on the line. Harry from Derby, are you still on the line?
Yeah.
Okay, please, thank you for waiting, and go ahead, please.
I have a question. I was watching the news, and
you know what? I think the line's breaking up. We can't quite hear what you are saying.
I said, did you hear me now?
A little bit better. A little bit better. Go ahead.
Yeah, that guy was talking over me. Hey, I was watching the news, and it's showing on a map of sanctuary cities and states, and it showed Kansas. I mean, we're not a sanctuary state, are we?
Harry, did you guys catch
Is Kansas a sanctuary state is what I heard, but I don't know if that's the right question.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. We can't hear you very clearly at all.
Kansas ensure that
Yes, okay, that's the question. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, we
No,
are not.
We're not. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on to Mary. I didn't catch the city you were in. But Mary
Peabody.
Peabody. Mary, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
I am calling in reference to the Capers
Okay.
funds too, and you have covered pretty well what I had wanted to know. You've decided about whether I should have had it long time ago when I was 57, and I decided, I wasn't able to decide what kind of things I wanted to invest to, and I think that any teacher that you can talk to, we don't want that changed. I have already received probably more than I put in, but I guess you guys knew you had to be putting into it too, which you weren't, and investing your part. So that's what I would like to tell everyone about when you are talking to them. Tell them that they will not, if they're their young teacher, they don't have time to be doing that. And we do have some good investors up there, just as you said. One time we didn't, but we've got that taken care of. So I'm going to move on to a different one. What about the wind farms? We have a wind farms that's big wanting to be moving into this area, and we've had farmers against farmers in that. So do you have anything to suggest up there? Thank you. I'll turn it off now.
Okay, thank you very much. So the second issue was wind farms.
So something we've dealt with quite a bit through our regions of the state, and it's embraced differently in each area. And the reality is, I think local zoning is our best way to approach that, where we have counties or areas that wish to have that investment. Great, how do we work together? How do we work with each of the residents that are there? If we have cities or developments that have concerns, we need to make sure those voices are heard, so that as different developments come up, whatever it is, but wind in particular is a challenging one right now, to make sure that those concerns are addressed as they can be. And we not only were there concerns about the towers, but the siting of the transmission lines and where those poles go. Each of those requires a lot of thought, and I know that many of our county commissioners have dealt with that in detail and tried to at least figure out how to make that work. I don't know that there is a good statewide policy. I'm open to any suggestions of how we might better address that to make sure that is met. But it's a little different as I hear the issues even in McPherson County on one end of my district to the issues in Ellsworth and how it was considered.
In southwestern corner of the state, our wind generation farms have been a tremendous neighbor and tremendous asset in all of our communities. And so in some regard, we haven't confronted some of the issues that have been brought to Topeka and the concerns that are involved there. So I guess initially I'll put in a plug for the fact that the wind generation farms in our corner of the state have been tremendous neighbors, both with our school districts, our local governments, and such. I do tend to lean toward the fact of I'm not sure that there are always great solutions that come out of Topeka, but I would hope that we can get to a spot where we make sure that local governments are providing at least the opportunities for citizens to have a voice in siting locations and the like, because when those farms start coming in, they are significant in regard to how they show up. So I'm not sure that I view that as a state resolution to that, but I do understand the concerns that folks have.
The one thing that we could address is, and this happened when, I may get the name wrong, but I think when the Grain Belt transmission line was going through southwest Kansas, up through many parts of my district, and then cutting over across the states of Missouri, Illinois, and then transferring that power to the state of Indiana. And what the Kansas Corporate Commission had done is they gave the company that was building this transmission line eminent domain. That excluded any type of local government. That also gave them the power, in essence, to basically stronghold the landowners, oil developers, cattlemen across that entire district. Since the state of Missouri has held out until just recently. The authorization for the eminent domain status, I believe, has expired. They only had it for 5 years.
I see.
So they have to go before the Kansas Corporate Commission again. Now, I have talked to the new owners who are wanting to put the transmission line in and expressed my concerns with what happened before and what happened with my constituency, and have basically entailed them not to take that route, to work with the landowners, work with the farmers, work with the oil producers, and not just stronghold them and say, this is the way it's going to be and this is what we're going to pay you. And they have completely understood the issues that caused and the concerns it had with the constituents. So when they go back to the KCC for authorization, I hope they keep that in mind.
Oh, very good, very good. Okay, we have Harry from Derby back on the line. Go ahead, Harry.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you.
Yeah. Hey,
Thumbs up.
I got two questions. How come the people or our representatives are not informing the people that the money we get from the federal government to expand Medicaid runs out in 2 years, and then after that, it's up to the state to continue to pay for it, the taxpayers of that state?
Do you have a second question? And I'll write them both down, and then we'll discuss them.
Okay, and the other is, they say we are a sanctuary state.
Sanctuary state. I think we.
Yeah, they were a sanctuary state on the news.
I guess I'd like to know who is saying we're a
Yeah, I
sanctuary
don't.
state.
I think the general consensus here is we're not. So.
I think in many instances, the terminology gets thrown around just in terms of just general conversation. It is not a it's not a legal term, I guess, is what I would start with.
Okay, do we have sanctuary cities in the state?
No, you're kind of running into the same circumstance. You may find people that want to use that terminology for certain cities, but there's no legal status in that regard.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Address Medicaid too.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But you know what? Let me. I got put a pin in that because Bob from Hayes is back on. So we'll take your question, Bob, and then we'll make sure we address both the issues.
Okay.
So Bob from Hayes, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I called earlier there about capers. I got a couple more questions.
Okay.
The long-term rate of return that capers has returned over the years, or the last 5 years, if you know. And then also, you guys were going to pay interest on the money that you didn't, when you didn't pay it to capers, and they started out at 10%, and then they said, well, that's too much. What did they decide that they were going to pay on that? Thank you.
Okay, you bet. Thank you.
That's 7.8.
Since we're at capers, go ahead and discuss capers, and we'll get back to Medicaid.
You know, I don't know that I can nail the last 5-year return exactly. The long-term return has continued to stay right at 8.3% over 20 and 25 years. The 10-year return, the lowest we hit was 5.7 when we went through the decline. And I don't know the highest off the top of my head, but that's a pretty good range, generally in the 7 point to 8 point something, and remarkably consistent, more so than others, net returns. And that's what makes it work pretty well. The assumed rate of return is now 7 3/4. A few years ago it was 8%, and the board lowered that to 7 3/4. Possible it could go to 7.5. I don't know of when it was 10%. That's a number I'm not familiar with, but the rate of interest that we have been paying was 8%. Now it is 7 3/4. When we go forward in the Tier 3 world, it changes yet again. The Tier 3 world has a 4% guarantee, and then it's a rolling 5-year average that determines what excess return is accredited to the employees in that plan. But that's some of the long-term returns on capers, and could come up with more specific stuff. And capers, I think it's capers.com. I'm trying to remember if it's org or com. They have a lot of data as well, and is a really useful site in terms of details of what's going on.
Before we get to Harry's question about Medicaid expansion, let's go to Patricia in Concordia. Patricia, if you're there, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask about the voter rights bills that are going through. we hope is going through, to make it easier for people to participate in our democracy, and to be sure that Kansas raises our status in that.
Okay, thank you. I didn't quite catch the whole question, but I know it was about
Regarding voter fraud.
Yeah, and I think we had right at the end of the session, in those last 2 days, we passed a couple of provisions in regard to assisting in elections and making sure that we had more ballots with the opportunity to be counted. One of the provisions I recall talked about that if you were doing an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot, if the signatures did not appear to be consistent with a signature from when you registered to vote, you would be notified and had the opportunity to come in, verify that signature so that your ballot would in fact count. So there were several matters packaged in that last piece of legislation, and I apologize for not remembering all of those. We were working through a lot of bills those last 2 days, but both of the provisions in that election piece were to expand allowing people to get their votes counted. And the one was the signatures, and it seems like there was another period of time that we expanded in terms of being able either to request a mail-in ballot or something in that regard. I apologize for not remembering more of the specifics, but it was increasing access.
The one that sticks out in my mind is the signatures piece, because either if it didn't match or if it was omitted, the signature wasn't even there. A lot of your smaller counties, the county clerk will call and say, well, we don't have your signature on the ballot.
Right.
Yeah.
But in your larger counties, that's probably more problematic, where they don't just have the time. And so and they didn't know they had the authority to either. And so this bill just gives them the authority to say, yes, if there's a signature missing on the ballot, the absentee ballot, you can call the voter, and then after verifying that it is them, have them sign it and have it be a county ballot when it's counted at the county level.
Very good. Harry, I promise we're going to get to your Medicaid question, but we do have another caller, Nick from Victoria. Go ahead, Nick, if you're there.
Yes, I've got 2 questions for the panel today. I would like if there's an update on the 5G and broadband around the state at the state level, and also what is the status of any kind of raises for state employees. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. Broadband, upgrading to 5G.
Well, and I just happened to see this on the news the last couple of nights, where they were talking about the capability of 5G and what it can do if it is in your area. I don't know if it's specifically talking about 5G, but I know the Rural Revitalization Committee that was just created by the Speaker of the House this year in the House of Representatives, chaired by Chairman Don Heineman, they spent an extensive amount of time in regards to broadband and the need for broadband in rural areas of the state. I don't think any is generated as far as legislation from that committee, but they did spend an ample amount of time talking about the need and the ability to get broadband out to our rural areas. The other part of that is also Governor Kelly has created within her administration, which is headed by Lieutenant Governor Lynn Rogers, is the Office of Rural Prosperity. And he has been focusing on many different nuances and aspects of rural life, and one of those is the availability of broadband for rural Kansas. But as far as any type of legislation, we haven't seen anything that's specifically targeted towards broadband. I do know that in discussions with Chairman Heineman, he has mentioned that this year is kind of like a learning process of trying to learn all the different aspects. So his committee is aware of what's going on, because you do have urban legislators that are serving on that committee as well.
Sure.
And so they are wanting to get a basic understanding of the needs of rural Kansas, and next year possibly seeing more legislation moving through the legislative system. In regards to raises for the state employees, that was something that the Appropriations Committee addressed in many different areas. State employees in general. We also looked at it for the judicial branch employees. And we went to conference, as we were talking about. The House bill had that we were going to give a 2.5% pay increase to all state employees if they were not otherwise mentioned in the bill for another pay increase. When we went to the Senate, when we were in conference, they did not have that provision in their bill. So that was a difference between the House and the Senate position. And so what we have decided to do is we've decided to table that item until the legislative term of omnibus, which is when we go back to veto session, which starts on May 1st, and we resume the conference committee, and we're going to be discussing how we want to address pay increases for the state employees. Both chambers completely understand that for quite some time the state employees across the state of Kansas have not received a pay increase. We tried to change that and rectify that issue in 2017 when we gave the first series of pay increases. But we're not there. We still have underfunded our state employees, and so we are going to be addressing it. How we go about addressing that may be a completely different manner, but that's something that we're going to be discussing in the conference committee between the House and the Senate.
Very good. Anything to add on that, or is that good?
That's pretty good.
You know what? We have some other callers, but I'm going to go ahead and get back to Harry's point because I want to make sure we don't miss it. I think specifically he was asking about
Medicaid and
ending in 2 years.
Funding ends in 2 years from the federal
and I want to go back and give him honor due on the sanctuary question. I took a moment to look it up to try and figure out, where did that come from? And it is possible. During the last gubernatorial campaign, one of our candidates had made the claim that Kansas was the sanctuary state of the Midwest. And it seemed that claim had caught some eyes. And so then I don't know if this counterclaim is completely right, but it's from the Topeka Capital Journal. And they went through and they went through a number of things, but specifically did state Kansas has not passed any laws that limit cooperation with federal immigration authorities, unlike another Midwest state, and they named Illinois. So some had done that, and it appears that was the definition of the sanctuary state. And then another person had weighed in that said that the state doesn't have any prohibition or limits on cooperation with the government, and even the most broad definition of sanctuary would not apply to Kansas. The campaign said they made the claim because bordering states have passed laws discouraging illegal immigration. So not necessarily dealing with the sanctuary state piece, but perhaps having a more aggressive stance, being proactive, and that may have created some confusion on whether we were actually a sanctuary state. But on the definition, we would not be, and we do not have sanctuary cities, although perhaps the state could pass a law banning sanctuary cities. There's some gray area on that. That may be more than we wanted to get into, but I was trying to figure out what that was.
Me and Brad's committee.
Yeah, right.
It's always nice to be able to move things to another committee. Yes.
From there to Medicaid, and the future of that in Kansas is still unlikely at this point. The ability for that to be taken up in the Senate, I think, is fairly small. So I don't know that will be moving forward. If it would, there is discussion. Would that end in 2 years with 36 states now participating in Medicaid expansion? What does that funding look like at the federal level? A question that I have is, can we afford it at the federal level? But as we bring that to Kansas, the likelihood of that, I think we have a different set of issues to consider in terms of, will it end cold turkey in 2 years? And one of the things that, and Representative Waymaster can talk to it, we have to make sure that if dollars decrease and the program is expanded, that there is a way to stop that, and that will be exceedingly hard. How do you make sure that actually happens? But at this point, I think the jury may be out on whether that funding would end in 2 years or whether Congress would continue to act to keep the funding intact.
I have never heard, as the current system the way it is now, according to the ACA, that the funding of the 90-10 split share between the federal government and the states is ending in 2 years. I can surmise that probably where that might be coming from is just recently President Trump has come out with a Republican plan that they do not want to run in Congress until after the election in 2020, in hopes that the Republicans regain the House. And so then they would be able to move this legislation through. I don't know if that's the 2 year window, but I've also heard that even if the Republicans regain the House and they do push this health care plan through, that Medicaid expansion is part of that plan anyways. That if you have expanded Medicaid, you will not lose the dollars that the federal government is already supplying to the individual states that have already expanded Medicaid. I agree with Stephen. We had a discussion with this with the Kansas County officials in Colby this week, where someone asked us in regards to Medicaid expansion, and we passed the House. It's over in the Senate now, sitting in the Senate Health Committee. There was a motion by the minority leader in the Senate to take it out of committee and move it below the line, which is all those bills that have not been scheduled for debate in the Senate. That takes 24 votes in order to that happen. That would be a stretch in order for that to happen. Okay. Especially when you're talking about there's 11 Democrats, 1 independent, you would have to have 12 other Republicans vote in favor of moving it out of committee and below the line. And then the next move would be to move it from below the line to above the line to a scheduled debate, and that would take 27. And I just don't see the Senate having the votes in order to do those two procedural moves in order to have a debate on Medicaid expansion in the Senate.
Okay, let's get back to that if we have time, but let's move to Bobby, if you're there still. Bobby from Garden City.
I think it was the first call.
Yes. Hey, thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah, go ahead.
My question is about the Second Amendment, and it has to do with the red flag bills that are being put through many states. I know that Colorado has their bill on the governor's desk. I just want to know your guys' thoughts.
Well, Bobby, hold up 1 second. We heard Second Amendment and then it went out. So can you try one more time with your question, please?
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Sort of.
Can you hear me okay?
Go ahead and try.
My question is about the Second Amendment. If you guys are going to consider the red flag bill that's being pushed through other states.
Red flag bill, okay. Before you hang up, are we aware of what the red flag bill is?
I'm not sure that I've seen any version of that legislation come to us in terms of the red flag bill. I think that would be the legislation or proposed legislation that starts identifying potential, like a boyfriend or a spouse or whatever, that in an abusive situation where you have just the proverbial red flag, the concern of something where you would then, if you're under protective order, then the potential confiscation of handguns or weapons at that point. I haven't seen any particular version of that in our legislative session.
Okay.
I haven't either.
Okay. So it'd come out of our Federal and State Affairs Committee, and I haven't heard anything about that coming before us.
All right. Does that answer your question, Bobby? No, there. Okay. Adam from Norton. Adam, if you are on the line, go ahead, please.
Thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
Thank you for taking my call, and thanks for having the program. 2 questions. One, does Kansas have a rainy day fund that's set aside for a setback? Is it 2%, 5% of the budget? And if we don't do something about Medicare or Medicaid, how many small rural hospitals and clinics are, say, one quarterly payment?
I don't think you can hear me.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Hey, Adam, let me go ahead and explain that we were not able to actually hear what you asked, so if you wouldn't mind calling back, we'll try to get you back on the line. We've got your introduction, and then it faded right out, so we have no idea how to respond. So please call back if you can.
Thank you for the program for us being
Yeah, you like the program, but that's all we got, so please call back. Please call back. Are any of the issues that we've been discussing, do you want to jump back into and highlight some issues we didn't get to while we're waiting for Adam to call back?
The only other, while they're looking through their Troy and they were looking through lists, I might point out one of the issues that came through the Judiciary Committee we dealt with was in locating, in this case, electric lines on person's property and when the digging is going on. And we clarified the idea that the utilities were responsible to that point in the services where they came up to a shut-off switch, if you will, and that there was responsibility for the landowners for lines that were on their own property. So I see that you've got another call coming in, so we'll see if we can hold on to that one right quick.
Okay. We'll get back to that if we have a chance. Anna Marie, and I believe it's from Ellis. Okay, very good. Anna Marie from Ellis, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for answering
have there been any more discussions about a possibly early release program for nonviolent visitors?
Nope. Anna Marie, hold on one second. We heard the possibility of, and then it cut out. I apologize.
Everyone
Right when it gets to the question.
gets to the subject.
So if you wouldn't mind repeating your question real quick, I apologize.
Oh, my question was if there have been any more discussions about possible early releases for nonviolent prisoners.
Early release for nonviolent prisoners. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I think there have been general discussions in that regard, mainly from the standpoint of the pressure on our prison systems right now and our inmate populations and the availability of prison space. I don't know that we have had anything specific legislatively in the last two sessions, but I know that's a significant topic that's being considered both in corrections and judiciary conversations as to how we can try to lessen that particular stress that's on the prison populations right now, because it is taxing us significantly.
And that's a reform topic that has caught a lot of discussion, at least. And what's been interesting is, you know, a lot of times we wind up picking sides before we get the issue down. And in this case, we have, you know, I think the ACLU has talked about reform, and some of the further right groups have talked about reform. And I think that could be a great way for us to work towards common ground and say, so which of these groups, to everyone's benefit, could we start relooking at sentencing and the resources that we spend?
Oh, absolutely. Low-level and nonviolent offenders, you know, we have to start giving some consideration, even from just simply a dollars and cents, not sacrificing public safety, but in terms of how do we best use our resources in addressing those folks and accomplishing a reintegration back into our communities. So, yeah, it will be a subject that requires some very significant discussion going forward.
Very good. Thank you for that. I think we have another caller right now. Dawn from Hayes. Dawn, if you're on the line, please go ahead.
Hi. Adam from Ward asking about a rain state have.
I can't. Can you? Hey, Dawn, we're having trouble hearing you. Can you try one more time, please?
Adam is calling from North.
Well, we can't hear her either.
I'm sorry.
If the state had a rainy day fund.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Boy, I can talk about that for a long time.
So does the state have a rainy day fund?
I think she mentioned that's what Adam was trying to ask.
Right,
so,
which
okay.
is great. So thank
you.
for calling in and
Thank you,
getting
Dawn.
that. Appreciate that.
Yes, we do have a rainy day fund. No, we have no money in it. It's a very odd situation that we have placed ourselves in the state of Kansas. A couple years ago, we passed where we would create what is called the Budget Stabilization Fund, or also known as the Rainy Day Fund. Right. However, we have no mechanism of diverting funds into that fund. We've tried numerous times in our budget bills in the last few years of trying to say if there's a certain amount over the ending balance or a certain percentage or above the consensus revenue estimates, or half of it would go towards capers and half of it would go into the rainy day fund. And the chamber that has been stopping it every single time is the state Senate. They have made the argument that we have debt, we have other items that we have obligations for, and therefore we should be paying for those obligations and paying down that debt as opposed to putting it into a savings account. I have differed with them every single time I've argued with the Senate in regards to that, because being a former banker, you try to address all the needs of your financial background. That would be what you have going in and out, which would say be your checking account. Money that you could put aside, which for the state of Kansas would be money that you could divert into the rainy day fund, and your debt and your obligations that you need to pay and make sure that those payments are being made. In fact, I just went to a fiscal leaders meeting in Chicago where all the Midwestern states get together and members from those states meet and talk about the fiscal problems or concerns with each of their states. And they pointed out how Kansas has a rainy day fund, but yet has a zero balance. That is something that we definitely need to address, and the reason why I say that, because there are members in the Republican Party, there's the governor, who have been expressing a concern and a need to prepare ourselves for the next recession. What better way to do that than put money away that we have now, so if we do happen to hit a recession, we are able to tap into that fund and help us through the tough times.
Very good, thank you. We got about 1 minute left, so we're not taking any more calls, which we sort of didn't do anyway.
I kind of want to go back to Harry.
But please, we have
on
a
Medicaid
left.
expansion.
Okay.
He had mentioned, the federal government dollars would be ending in 2 years. And as we kind of discussed here on the panel, we haven't heard that. We think that's going to continue, regardless of what may happen on the federal level. But we did have when we had the medication bill, we did have an amendment that said if the federal government ever shall do that, then we would not fund Medicaid expansion. So I just wanted to add that.
Very good, thank you for doing that. I think that clears up that there is no magic 2-year limit. It's just something that people hear.
Correct.
All right, I guess we're wrapping things up here. Thank you very much. I want to thank the callers that called in and tried to speak to us. This has been Mike Walker and the panel. I'm from Fort Hays State University. I wish you all a happy evening.